The day the city told me to demolish the last house my late wife ever designed, a woman in a hard hat walked onto my construction site, spread my blueprints across the hood of her truck, and said the words that would either destroy my career or save my son's life. Before I tell you what those words were and how the woman, the city sent to condemn my life's work, became the reason my little boy learned to speak again after 2 years of total silence, do me one small favor. If you believe that the thing you build out of grief can somehow become the thing that carries you back to joy, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is going to walk you all the way to the edge of losing everything and then show you what waits on the other side. Stay with me. It earns the ending, I promise. My name is Andre Coleman. I'm 40 years old. I stand 6'3", and I've been designing buildings in my head since I was old enough to hold a pencil straight. My mother raised me and my 3 younger sisters in a cramped third-floor apartment where the ceiling leaked over my bed every single time it rained, and I used to lie there in the dark catching the drips in an old coffee can. One slow drop at a time, and drawing houses on the back of my school papers by the light coming in from the street. Houses with no leaks, houses with tall windows and room to breathe and a place for everybody. I promised myself in that leaking room that one day I would build spaces where people didn't have to catch the rain in a can while they slept. That promise is the whole reason I became an architect. And for a long time, I was a good one, maybe even a great one, because I was never really building for money. I was building for that little boy with the coffee can. I did almost all of it beside a woman named Diane, who I married when we were both 26 and broke and carrying around far more ambition than sense. Diane was an architect too, and she was better than me, and I will say that to anyone who asks. Where I was all discipline and straight lines and load calculations, she was all instinct and warmth and light. She could look at an ugly, impossible lot, a weird triangle of dirt nobody else wanted, and see a home in it, the way some people see shapes in clouds. We scraped together everything we had and started a tiny firm. Coleman and Coleman, 2 names etched on a frosted glass door we could barely afford to rent the room behind. And 2 years after that, we made the best thing either of us would ever make, better than any building, better than any drawing, a son named Malcolm. Diane died when Malcolm was 4 years old. A delivery driver ran a red light on a wet Thursday afternoon while she was walking back to the office with a heavy roll of drawings tucked under her arm. They told me she was gone before the ambulance ever reached her. And do you want to know where I was in the moment the light turned red and the world ended? I was at the office standing over a materials board choosing a shade of gray for a hotel lobby floor. I was holding 2 nearly identical gray swatches up to the window, trying to decide which one looked more expensive when my wife's heart stopped 4 blocks away. I have never chosen that shade of gray. I never finished that lobby. And to this day, there is a certain flat, cool gray that I cannot look at without feeling the floor drop straight out from under me, because it is the exact color I was thinking about while Diane died alone on a wet street with drawings scattered around her in the rain. Malcolm stopped talking 3 days after the funeral. He was 4.5, and he had been the kind of child who narrated his entire life out loud, who told you what the ants were doing and what the clouds looked like and what he thought the dog next door was probably dreaming about. And then one gray morning, he simply stopped all at once, as though someone had reached inside his small chest and quietly turned off a switch. The doctors had a long clinical name for it. Selective mutism brought on by acute trauma, they called it. They ran every test there is, and they assured me that nothing was broken, not in his throat, not in his brain, that he was fully capable of speech in the mechanical sense. But somewhere down inside his grief, my 4-year-old son had made a decision. He had decided that the world was far too dangerous a place to put words into, that speaking out loud was how you lost people. And so for 2 full years, my boy did not say a single word, not to me, not to his teachers or his therapists or the other children, not to anyone anywhere for 2 years. He wasn't gone, understand. He was still in there. He communicated in drawings, page after page of them, and in a small spiral notebook he carried absolutely everywhere, and wrote in with careful block letters, and in the fierce, tight grip of his hand around 2 of my fingers whenever we crossed a street. But the house we lived in, which had once been so loud with his chatter that Diane and I used to joke about needing earplugs, went completely silent. And I want to tell you something I learned in those 2 years. You hear a great many things in a silence like that. Mostly you hear your own regrets played back to you over and over at 3 in the morning. You hear a shade of gray. The The last project Diane and I ever designed together was a house, not for a wealthy client. It was in a way our house, though we never got to live in it. A small, strange, impossibly beautiful thing we designed for an elderly widow named Mrs. Okafor, who owned a difficult narrow lot at the very end of a dead-end street, a lot that 3 other firms had already turned down as unbuildable. Diane didn't see unbuildable. She saw a house built around a central open-air courtyard with a single old live oak tree left standing right in the middle of it, so that every single room in the home, the kitchen, the bedrooms, the hall, all of them looked out onto something alive and growing and permanent. She engineered the entire roof to float over that tree without ever touching it, transferring its weight down through 2 hidden interior columns instead of the outer walls, so the tree could keep growing for another 200 years, and the house would simply grow around it. It was the most beautiful thing she ever drew. It was the last thing she ever worked on. She was carrying the final courtyard drawings under her arm when the light turned red. Miss Okafor, God, rest. Her insisted that I build it anyway, even after Diane was gone. She was an old woman, and she understood grief better than the young doctors did, and she told me, holding my hand in both of her papery ones, that my wife's fingerprints were in those walls, and she wanted to spend her last years living inside them. So I built it. I poured 2 entire years of grief into every joint, every window frame, every board. It was without any question the finest work of my life, and I know exactly why. I did it for a ghost, and you do not cut corners for a ghost. And then the very week the house was finally finished, Mrs. Okafor passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 88 before she ever spent a single night under Diane's floating roof. Her grown children scattered across the country didn't want the strange house at the end of the dead-end street. And the city, it turned out, had never formally signed off on the courtyard structure. Some decades, old zoning rule about the required setback and the load-bearing wall around the tree, a rule. Diane's design quietly, brilliantly broke in order to do something better. A new inspector working from a checklist had flagged it, which brings me at last to the gray October morning when this story truly begins. I was standing on the site of the last house my wife ever designed, holding a single sheet of paper from the city. The notice said in flat bureaucratic language that the structure was non-compliant and had to be either brought into full code within 90 days or demolished at the owner's expense. 90 days or the bulldozer. The last thing Diane ever made in this world, condemned by a rubber stamp and a man with a clipboard who had never once looked up at the tree. And that was the moment the woman in the hard hat walked onto my site. Her name, I would learn, was Emily Hart. She was a structural engineer, and the city had assigned her to my case, which I bitterly assumed meant she'd been sent to help the demolition crew measure the swing radius for the wrecking ball. She was somewhere in her mid-30s with sandy blonde hair tucked up under a battered yellow hard hat sunburned across the bridge of her nose, and she carried a set of steel calipers and a laser level, the easy, unconscious way other people carry their car keys. She walked right past me without so much as a hello, unrolled my blueprints across the warm hood of her truck, and then she stood there and read them. For a long time. 10 minutes. 15. Tracing the lines with one finger, her lips moving very slightly as she followed the loads down through the structure, frowning, going back, tracing again. I finally couldn't stand the silence. "You here to sign the demolition order?" I asked her. It came out harder than I meant it to. She didn't look up from the drawings. "Who designed this?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. "My wife," I said. "And me, mostly my wife." "This load path around the tree," she was still tracing it slow and careful, "the way the entire roof transfers its weight down to these 2 hidden interior columns instead of resting on the courtyard wall. That's not in any textbook I've ever read, and I've read a great many textbooks." Now she looked up, and her eyes were a pale, clear green and completely serious. Whoever thought of this was thinking about the tree living for 200 years. Nobody engineers for 200 years anymore, Mr. Coleman. We build for 30 years and we walk away and we let the next person tear it down. This is different. This is somebody who meant it. She looked back down at the paper. This house isn't non-compliant. It's just ahead of the code. And there is a very large difference between those two things, and it is exactly my job to know that difference. I don't think you should demolish this house. I think we should fight for it. I stood there in the cold October wind with the condemnation notice going soft in my sweating hand, and I could not make my mouth work, because for 2 solid years I had been the only person left alive who believed those walls were worth saving. And now a total stranger in a battered hard hat had read my dead wife's mind straight off a sheet of paper and had decided on the spot to come and stand beside me. We fought for that house. That is a whole story on its own, 4 months of zoning hearings and variance requests and structural load calculations and appeals. Emily writing report after report in language so precise and so unshakably certain that the city's own engineers eventually ran out of arguments and simply went quiet. She did most of it on her own time, long after her assigned hours were finished and billed. She'd show up at the site at 7 in the evening with a thermos of coffee and a fresh stack of calculations and work under a work light until it was fully dark. I asked her once, standing in the empty courtyard, why she cared so much about saving one small house at the end of one dead-end street, a house that wasn't hers, for a man she barely knew. She was quiet for a long while. Then she set down her coffee and she said, "My father was a carpenter, a framer mostly. He built things to last, and he used to tell me a building is a promise you make to people you are never going to meet. The family that lives there in 50 years after you're dead, they're trusting you right now, tonight, to have done it right." He believed that. She was quiet again. Then he gave 30 years to one company and he got sick and they laid him off 2 months before his pension vested. 2 months. And he spent the last part of his life sitting in a chair by the window, feeling like not one single thing he'd built in his whole life had actually mattered to anybody. He died believing that. She picked the coffee back up and her voice was steady, but her hand wasn't quite. "So I became an engineer, to make sure the promises hold. That's the whole reason. And this house is somebody's promise, Mr. Coleman. I could feel it the second I read the drawings. Whoever designed this loved the people who were going to live here, and they never even met them. I am not going to be the one who breaks that. I won't do it." I didn't tell her that night that the person who made the promise was dead and that she'd been my wife. I don't fully know why. Maybe because it was the first time in 2 years that someone had spoken about Diane's work without pity as an equal engineer to engineer across time, and I didn't want to turn it into a story about grief. I just wanted for one more evening to hear a stranger admire my wife's mind for what it was and not for what I'd lost. I started bringing Malcolm to the site on the weekends. I didn't plan it as some kind of therapy. The plain truth is, I had nowhere else to leave him and no money for a sitter. So my silent 6-year-old came along with his spiral notebook and his tin of colored pencils, and he'd sit on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in the half-finished courtyard under the tree and draw. And Emily, from the very first Saturday, did something none of the doctors and none of the well-meaning relatives had ever managed to do. She did not fuss over him. She didn't crouch down and aim 100 gentle questions at him that everyone already knew he wouldn't answer. She didn't get that soft, wet, pitying look in her eyes that made my son shrink into himself like a snail touched on the horn. She just walked over that first Saturday and handed him a real 30-foot tape measure, the heavy metal kind, and said, "Malcolm, I need to know exactly how tall that doorway is, top of the sill to the header, and I am way too busy to do it myself. Can you handle that for me?" Malcolm looked up at her for a long moment with those careful eyes he got from his mother. Then he took the tape measure, and he walked over to the doorway, and he measured it top to bottom, and he wrote the number down in his notebook in his careful block letters, and he tore out the page and held it up to her without a word. "Perfect," Emily said, taking it and reading it and nodding like it was the most ordinary transaction in the world. "Exactly what I needed. You're hired." And that was it. That was the beginning of the whole thing. She gave him a real job every single weekend after that. "Measure this, count these bolts, and tell me if there are 60. Sight down this line and tell me if it's straight because your eyes are better than mine." And the whole time she worked, she talked to him. Not waiting for answers, just talking easy and constant, narrating her thoughts out loud the way you talk to a good friend who happens to be quiet that day. The way you talk to someone you fully expect to talk back one afternoon when they're good and ready. She'd say, "Now your dad thinks this beam ought to be steel. But between you and me, I think your dad is dead wrong about that. What do you think?" And Malcolm would draw his answer, a quick sketch, and hold it up, and she would study it with total seriousness and say, "You know what? You're both wrong. It should be wood. Look here, I'll show you why." And my son, who had not laughed out loud in 2 years, would sit on his overturned bucket and shake all over with silent laughter. I watched it happen week after week. I watched a woman the city had sent to help demolish my dead wife's last house. Instead, quietly rebuild my living son one Saturday at a time, one small, real job at a time. And somewhere in those months, standing in that courtyard, I fell in love with Emily Hart. So slowly and so completely that by the time I understood it had happened, it had already been true for a long time. It was like watching one of my own buildings go up. You see it every day. And so you don't notice the change, the steel and the glass and the walls, and then one ordinary morning you look up, and it's simply there finished standing real, and you can't remember the empty lot at all. But I have to tell you about the day it all nearly came apart, because a happy ending you didn't have to bleed for isn't worth the breath it takes to tell. It was February, near the very end of the 4-month fight, and near the very end of the 90 days. We had won almost every battle by then, worn the city down report by report. But there was one final requirement standing between Diane's house and the wrecking ball, a live load test on the courtyard roof, the trickiest, most audacious part of the whole design, the part Diane had made to float over the tree without touching it. If the roof held the required weight, the house lived permanently code-approved, safe forever. If it failed, the bulldozer was booked for Monday morning. Emily had designed and built the entire test rig herself, a scaffold and pulley system to stack half a ton of steel weights onto the roof in stages while sensors measured the deflection. And on the cold, bright morning of the test, something went wrong. I wasn't looking when it started. I was around the side of the house, parking the truck, my back turned for maybe 30 seconds. Malcolm had run ahead into the courtyard the way he always did the moment we arrived, straight to his bucket under the tree. And a steel cable on the load rig, wound up under enormous tension, slipped its clamp and snapped loose and whipped screaming across the courtyard, and the stack of half-ton steel weights it had been holding lurched and shifted and began to tip. And I came around the corner of the house just in time to see my 6-year-old son standing frozen and staring directly underneath 1,000 pounds of steel that was sliding, tilting, coming down on top of him. I want so badly to tell you that I did something. I did nothing. I froze. 2 years, almost to the day, after a red light took my wife while I stood picking floor colors. I stood at the corner of that house and I froze exactly the same way. Useless, too far away, too slow. My mouth open around my son's name and no body behind it. Emily did not freeze. Emily was already moving. She was halfway across that courtyard before I'd even finished screaming, and she hit my son at a dead run and drove him bodily out from under the falling steel, and the two of them went down hard together against the base of Diane's tree as 1,000 pounds of weight came crashing down onto the exact patch of dirt where Malcolm had been standing a half-second before. Close enough that the edge of the falling steel caught the sleeve of Emily's jacket and tore it open and opened a long gash down her forearm that would later take 11 stitches to close. For one endless roaring second, there was nothing but dust and clanging silence, and I could not see either of them through it, and I thought with a calm that terrifies me to remember, this is it. This is the red light again, and I did nothing again. And then out of that dust, out of 2 full years of unbroken silence, I heard a voice I had very nearly forgotten the sound of, small, cracked, high with terror, and unmistakably, impossibly real. Emily, my son said, out loud, the first word Malcolm had spoken in 2 years. Emily, are you okay, Emily? Emily, she pushed herself up to sitting against the trunk of the tree, one hand clamped over her bleeding arm, and she looked at my son kneeling beside her in the dust, and she began to laugh and cry at the exact same time. I'm okay, buddy, she said, gasping. I'm okay. I promise I'm okay. But Malcolm, listen to me. You talked. Do you know you just talked? You said my name. Malcolm looked at her, and then he looked past her at me, stumbling toward them across the courtyard, and then he did the thing that broke my heart into pieces and rebuilt it in the very same instant. His face crumpled, and he said, I got scared. When you fell, I forgot to be quiet. And then my son, who had held 2 years of unspoken words dammed up behind his small teeth like a river held back by a wall, pressed his whole face into Emily's good shoulder and let every last bit of it out at once. Crying and talking and talking and crying, 2 years of words pouring out of him against a stranger's shoulder in the dirt underneath his mother's tree. The house passed the load test that same afternoon. Cracked rig, snapped cable, torn clothes and all. Emily flatly refused to reschedule, got her arm wrapped in a bandage right there on the tailgate of her truck. and insisted on finishing the test with her own hands, and she was right. Of course she was right. She was always right about that house. Diane's floating roof took every single pound they stacked onto it and did not so much as creak, held it the way it was designed to hold it, the way a good promise holds. The city inspector signed the paper standing in the courtyard. The house was saved permanently, forever. And by then I did not care about the house at all. I sat down on the overturned bucket in the courtyard my wife designed, and I listened to my son talk, just talk, about nothing at all, about the tree and the loud noise the steel made and whether pigeons have knees and whether Emily's arm would have a cool scar. 2 years of total silence broken open in a single afternoon, and I sat there, and I understood with my whole body that I would have taken that entire house apart with my bare hands, board by board, and thanked God on my knees for the privilege, because it had done the one and only thing that ever truly mattered. It had held my son up in the world long enough for someone brave to reach him. Malcolm did not stop talking after that day. Not all at once and not perfectly, but the dam was broken now, and the water kept coming more of it every single week. And every word of it for the first month was addressed to Emily. She was the door he had chosen to open. The therapists had a dozen careful, complicated theories about exactly why. I have a much simpler one, and I believe it with my whole heart. My son had spent 2 years secretly believing that loving someone was how you lost them, that the people you speak to can be taken away in the time it takes a traffic light to change from green to red. And then on a bright, cold morning, he watched a woman throw her own body under 1,000 pounds of falling steel, without a half-second's hesitation to keep him in the world. And somewhere in his 6-year-old heart, he finally understood that love could be the thing that runs toward you too, and not only the thing that gets torn away. That was worth breaking 2 years of silence for. That was worth talking again. I want to tell you how it all ended, but the honest truth is that it didn't end. It started when Mrs. Okafor's grown children heard the whole story, all of it. The 4-month fight and the load test and the little boy who found his voice under the tree. They changed their minds about selling. They signed the house over to us instead. For $1 and a written promise that we would live in it, that Diane's last house would finally, after everything, hold a family the way she had always meant for it to. So we moved in, the 3 of us, into the strange, beautiful house at the end of the dead-end street, built around a living tree with a bedroom for Malcolm that looked straight out onto the courtyard, where he found his voice again. Emily and I were married under that same tree 18 months later. Malcolm gave a toast out loud, standing on a chair in front of 40 people, a long, rambling 5-minute toast about roof beams and pigeons, and the one single time Emily was wrong about a doorway, and by the end of it, there was not one dry eye in the entire courtyard. Emily kept the scar on her forearm, the 11 stitches, and she has never once tried to hide it. She wears it plainly in short sleeves at the dinner table the way other people wear a wedding ring. Malcolm calls it her Malcolm scar, and on the nights when something frightens him, he asks to see it, and she rolls up her sleeve every single time without a word, and every single time it does the exact same thing it did that first afternoon in the dust. It reminds my son that somebody once ran toward him instead of away. The office still has 2 names on the frosted glass door, Coleman and Coleman. I never took Diane's name down, and I never will, but there is a second frosted door now just down the hall, and it reads, Coleman and Hart Structural, and Emily runs it, and every so often the 2 firms end up working on the very same building, the architect and the engineer. The dream and the promise that holds the dream up so it doesn't fall. I think Diane would have loved that more than almost anything in the world. She always used to say a building needs both halves, something to reach for the sky and something to make good and sure it never comes down. Malcolm is 9 years old now. He talks constantly, narrates his whole life out loud again, exactly the way he did before we lost his mother. The chatterbox came all the way home. He announces that he is going to be an engineer, not an architect, and when I pretend to be wounded by this, he just points across the room at Emily and says, "She saves people. You pick floor colors." He has no idea what that sentence does to me. He doesn't know about the 2 gray swatches or the red light or the 2 years his father spent frozen in place. He only knows that somebody ran toward him once under a tree his mother drew with her own hands, and that it changed the entire shape of his life. Sometimes late at night, after the 2 of them are asleep, I go and stand alone in that courtyard, and I look up at Diane's roof floating silently over the tree, the roof a stranger fought 4 months of her own life to save, the roof that held firm on the one morning when everything else I loved was falling. And I think about how the city sent someone to condemn the last thing my wife ever built, and how that someone read my dead wife's mind, threw her body between my living son and 1,000 pounds of steel, gave a silent boy back his voice, and a frozen man back his family, all under the same tree, all inside the same house. The house we ended up building twice, once out of grief, and once at long last out of love. If you made it all the way here with me, then you already understand that this was never really a story about a house. It was a story about the silence that falls over us after we lose someone, and about the person brave enough to keep talking to us through that silence week after week, never once making us feel broken for being quiet until the day we're finally ready to talk back. So before you go, do this one thing for me. If there is someone in your life who kept showing up for you like that, who kept talking to you through your silence and treated you like you were whole the entire time, put their name down in the comments. Just the name. Let them exist for 1 second in a place they will never see. And if this story reached you, if it got in past the wall even a little, then subscribe and stay with me, because I have more of these. True ones, hard ones, stories about the things we build out of grief that turn out in the end to be the very things that save us. The next one begins the same way all the good ones do, with a person standing alone in front of something they love being told that it has to come down. Because that, it turns out, is nearly always the exact moment right before someone walks in, picks up a hard hat, and helps you build it back up.